This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 66. We are going to start with a question from Sam from Seattle, who asks, from an evolutionary standpoint, what's the most optimal living environment for humans? And could small, community-based living on small farms align best with our biology?
Well, I'm going to start off by being a pain in the butt professor by saying it all depends on how you're defining things, defining optimal, defining aligning best. And the reason why one needs to ask that, because the assumption is that there is an our biology, something singular. And what you see instead is different human populations have different biologies. And thus we get the incredibly unuseful first conclusion that people who've been living in farmlands for generations and generations have usually evolved some adaptations to being optimal farmland livers and people who are pastoralists and people who are hunter gatherers, that over the course of generations, different types of ways of making a living, of filling your stomach in different types of ecosystems have selected for different traits. So rather than there being a singular our biology, it's worth instead comparing what are the evolutionary features of being a hunter-gatherer in contrast with being a farmer. Okay, unpacking first, some historical setting required that I say the following sentence. 99% of hominin history was spent in small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Humans have been hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Characteristics are small groups, 20, 30 individuals or so, nomadic, mobile, fluidity between membership and neighboring groups. And that's recently been shown. The original assumption was any given hunter-gatherer band is fairly inbred, high degree of relatedness. And it turns out that's not as much. Lots of flow between neighboring bands. What else? Hunter-gatherers are classically egalitarian. Hunter-gatherers classically hunter and gather. And one of the great sound bites about hunting gathering is amid every hunter-gatherer you ever asked, what's more important, hunting or gathering little plant thingies? Everybody of both sexes would say, oh, hunting. Hunting is far more important. And what most of the studies show is it's actually the foraging by women that are bringing in more calories for the family unit. Okay, so hunter-gatherers, they have fairly high infant mortality rates, but once somebody makes it to adulthood, their life expectancy is pretty good by Western standards. And some of the things you see going along with that are aspects of aging that we always have viewed as inevitable, universal, like as you get older, you tend to have an increase in blood pressure because your blood vessels become less elastic. As you get older, on the average, you put on weight, your BMI increases, and hunter-gatherers don't show any of these properties as they age. That's not an inevitability of aging. And a great way of summarizing advice everybody always gives about hunter-gatherers is have the diet of a hunter-gatherer, but have the vaccines of a westernized human. And that used to be sort of interesting of, oh, obviously get vaccines. And, oh, that's interesting having a hunter-gatherer diet. Pathetically, we've gotten to a point of obviously have a hunter-gatherer diet. And, whoa, it might be actually good for you to get a vaccine now and then. These are strange times we've entered. Okay, so anyway, that was the backdrop of hundreds of thousands of years of hunter-gatherers, a couple of transitional forms that emerged 10, 15,000 years ago. One is hunter-gatherers who stop being nomadic, and these are typically folks who are fishers. They get fish. They live on the side of a lake. It's a particularly good fishing hole. They don't move as much. They've become much more sedentary. Another intermediate form coming out of hunter-gathering is what's called hunter horticulturalists, people who are still hunting and gathering in a rainforest, but they're beginning to domesticate some plants. Okay, all all of that sets the stage for this massive, exciting shift in human history 10, 12, 15,000 years ago or so, when we started domesticating plants and domesticating animals and ushering in the birth of agriculture. And one of the things that's been happening ever since is agriculturists have been out competing hunter gatherers and pushing them into smaller and smaller environments, lousier environments. And we are seeing sort of the last gasp of hominid history of hunter gathering, very few of them. Okay, so we've got venerable old hunter gathering. We've got this new kid on the block of agriculture. So, what have been the evolutionary differences that have emerged? What's gone on evolutionarily among human agriculturalists in the last 10,000 years or so? First one is obvious when you think about what you're most often agriculturing, which is things with starch, things with rice and corn. And it's not until agriculture that it became common for humans to have a gene or multiple genes that are good for breaking down starch, absorbing starch. Very interestingly, you see the same thing. Hunter-gatherers don't have this gene, or they only have one copy. Farmers, agriculturalists for 10,000 years have been getting more copies. Hunting dog breeds don't have a gene for digesting starch. Farm dog breeds do. Okay, so that's one difference that's come in. What else? You see that, most famously, extension of being able to digest milk past weaning. You become lactose tolerant, and that's the novelty, and that's much more common among agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists with their cows and their camels and their sheep. And this is all in the last 10,000 years or so. What else? What else? Issues having to do with, stay tuned, dramatic foreshadowing, a feature of agricultural diet, which is it's a lot less varied than hunter-gatherer diets. And what that means is you're getting along on just a handful of crops instead of 300 different edible plants in your rainforest. As you have less variety in your diet, you have less variety in your gut microbiome. The different species of bacteria that assist you in breaking down food, you find much less variety in agricultural populations than in hunter-gatherer ones. And along with that, agriculturalists over these 10,000 years have had to evolve some differences in absorbing nutrients out of the gut because of these changes in the microbiome makeup. Okay, what else? Now we start getting into the dark underbelly of agriculture, which is you got a lot more cases where you don't have enough food. If you're a hunter-gatherer in virtually any setting between hunting, potentially following migratory herds or local populations of animals to hunt, and gathering, food intake is fairly constant throughout the year. During dry seasons, during wet seasons, the composition of the food might shift, but you don't have something that farming invented, which was every year during the dry season you get a little bit starved. You have a dramatic drop in body weight, normal fluctuation over the course of seasons, seasonality of food availability, and getting back to how there's only a couple of different types of foods that agriculturalists are subsisting on, you're much more vulnerable to a famine. You get some sort of, I don't know, hunter gatherer root thing, and there's a hunter gatherer root blight infection in it that wipes it all out. And bummer, but there's 99 other things to collect from the forest. Once you get agriculturalists, a much smaller number of farmed food sources, you're suddenly vulnerable to something like the potato blight, which wiped out Ireland in the 1840s. You're more vulnerable to famines. You're more vulnerable to droughts. You're more vulnerable to seasonal fluctuations. So there's had to be some evolutionary changes that have gone with that. And the term that's given for it is you evolve what's called a thrifty metabolism. Your pancreas, your insulin receptors, all sorts of other things change, evolve so that you are much better at storing nutrients. You are much better at retaining water and salt. And what's this about? Because of the seasonal, the dry seasons, and to protect you during famines. What's that about? That is a physiology that now sets you up umpteen centuries later when instead you're now having a westernized diet to get diabetes because you've got the genetics of agriculturalists with seasonal food shortages. Your body is really good at storing stuff. So you see that amongst agriculturalists, a more thrifty metabolism and genes underlying that than you see in hunter-gatherers. What else? What else? Now, as soon as sort of humans came up with this agriculture, I've ranted about this before, but in retrospect, this has to count as one of the all-time worst decisions humans ever made to make agriculture because you're now vulnerable to droughts and you're now vulnerable to seasonal fluctuations. And remarkably, as soon as humans became agriculturalists, people got shorter. People lived shorter. It took millennia until people had caught up with their pre agricultural average heights and lifespan. And, agriculture was not such a great idea. What else? Something else that happens as soon as you become an agriculturalist is you live in agricultural communities, farm communities. You live at higher density of individuals than hunter-gatherers do. And thus, you're exposed to more infectious agents. You're more exposed to animal infectious agents that may jump species barriers. Thank you, COVID. You're exposed to all. And what you see is agriculturalism involved evolving more robust immune responses, more robust inflammatory responses, and have that over the course of a lifetime. And we see a lot of the degenerative features of aging. Overactive immune system increases the likelihood of autoimmunity, and it also prompts the development of this interesting evolutionary trade-off as follows. Best evidence is malaria has existed for about 100,000 years, way back before agriculturalists. But there was a sudden explosion in the incidence of malaria about 10,000 years ago when humans, agriculturalists, were living in higher density settlements, sedentary with still water, mosquitoes having a fine time, suddenly malaria explodes in agricultural populations, and humans came up with an adaptation a mere 5,000 years later or so, sickle cell anemia being the diseased version of a genetic adaptation that protects you from malaria. One other thing that prompts agriculturalists to have immune systems that are highly activated, if you are a farmer, you do something that no self-respecting hunter-gatherer or non-human primate would ever dream of doing, which is day after day living in close proximity to your feces. Instead of picking up and, chimps each night, they make a different nest and hunter-gatherers on the move. And suddenly you got pathogenicity from that. So the high population density, the sudden change in diet, the sudden change in means of acquiring food, the amount of work needed, variable food availability for agriculturalists, all of this has selected for very different traits in 10,000 years than you find in hunter-gatherer populations. One last one that's very interesting and is a little bit speculative. I have mentioned so many times about the dopamine receptor DR4 gene, which binds dopamine. It's one of many dopamine receptors, and it comes in a variety of variants, a variety of flavors. And people have known for a while a few of the variants that are associated with novelty seeking and impulsivity and sensation seeking and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what you see is looking at some populational distributions of these gene types, as soon as people became intense communal agriculturalists, there were very strong selective pressures against these gene variants for novelty and sensation seeking and ADHD. Hunter-gatherers have higher rates of these variants than closely related farm populations do. And the point has been made, if you're a hunter gatherer, one of the things that ADHD is terrible for is planning for the future because of in the moment impulsivity, the time horizon shortens. If you're a hunter gatherer, you don't have to plan for a planting season. There's always going to be food. Hunter gatherer food acquisition is much more present tense than it is for agriculturalists. And what you get then is the exploratory genetics of hunters and nomadic. And so I think these wind up being some of the most characteristic differences. So that said, Sam, what you have to decide at this point is which lifestyle would you prefer? Because the odds are, if you pick one that your ancestors haven't been in for centuries and centuries, you may have some like bowel problems and be a little bit maladapted, but come back to your descendants in a bunch of centuries and they will have had some of these same shifts in some of these genetic traits.
Next, Diana from Colombia/Germany asks, what occurs in our minds when we forgive? Can even atrocious actions be forgiven by the victims?
Well, what a relevant question for these days, this century, this millennium. Forgiveness. Forgiveness, how does it work? What's going on in the brain? What are some of the psychological parameters of it? But first off, do we get people forgiving unforgivable, atrocious, appalling acts of violence? And humans have some extraordinary examples of that. One of them could be seen in Rwanda in the 1990s, the Rwandan genocide, in which the Hutu community turned on the Tutsi community and killed 75% of those people over the course of a few months. And remarkably, in the aftermath, villagers back before the genocide, villagers, Hutu and Tutsis who were neighbors, who were in some cases married to each other, they have managed to have a fair frequency of forgiveness on the part of Tutsi survivors of the Hutu sort of genocide let loose on them. So that's remarkable. Another example, written much smaller, was that unspeakable tragedy 10 years ago, wherever in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, where white supremacist neo-Nazi Dylan Roof came in and gunned down and killed 9 African American people praying there, and just nightmarish and one of the worst hate crimes in American history. And something that people commented on again and again and again is within a few days at his first arraignment, some of the close family members of people he had just killed forgave him and said they were praying for him. Another example, Primo Levi, the Italian novelist, the Italian author and chemist who spent part of World War II in a concentration camp doing slave labor in a chemistry factory. And years later, he was contacted by the man who had been his chemical factory slave master, who wanted to meet and explain himself and apologize. And Levy wrestled with it and eventually decided he was capable of meeting this man and forgiving him. So people can do some extraordinary stuff in terms of forgiving. Important right off the bat, and now thinking about its parameters, is what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not the same thing as saying the awful things that happened to you didn't really happen and didn't really feel that awful. That's not a part of it. More subtly, forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. And this really came to the forefront after South Africa got its freedom in the early 90s. And there was pioneering by Mandela, Desmond Tutu, others to establish the first of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where various criminals of the troubles there, and 95% of them were Afrikaans from the apartheid government, came before a panel and to some of the victims or loved ones of their violent crimes and said what they had done. And there was this heartwarming expectation beforehand that what was going to happen was if one of these murderers in jail applied to appear before a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and only a small subset did, and of that, only a small subset were approved, that they were there and they wanted to face the mother of the young man they tortured to death and apologize, and then she would forgive him in tearful scenes afterward. And there was a lot of disappointment because of recognizing that's not what reconciliation is about. Reconciliation is pragmatic, it's transactional, it's legalistic. All the criminal murderer had to do was say exactly what he had done so that there was no doubt about it and who had told him to do it if he was under somebody's command, and that he wouldn't do something like that again. He wasn't required to apologize. His victims and survivors weren't required to forgive him. This is what you see the emphasis on reconciliation in societies that have been just ripped apart by conflict in the Balkans after the Balkan Wars in the 90s and such, where there are so many grounds for vendettas and revenges and all of that. And nobody is asking you to forgive the person who murdered your loved one. We're just asking you to believe them when they say they are never doing something like that again, and for them to believe you when you say, and I'm not going to try to take vengeance. So that's a very different thing than forgiveness. What else? To forgive is not to forget, not remotely. And there's a fascinating neurobiology to that. For example, you have a lab rat that's been trained to think this grad student is a nice grad student, and then he's traumatized because today the rat gets a certain number of shocks in the cage administered by the grad student, and the rat develops a freezing response as soon as he's put back into that cage, a conditioned fear response. The presence of that grad student triggers this conditioned fear response, heart beats faster, stress hormones released. Now the next day the grad student puts the rat into the same cage and the rat freaks out but there's no shock. And over put him in and there's no shock. And what the rat gradually does is stop having a freezing response. Has he forgotten what the grad student was doing yesterday? Let alone that as a first step towards, has he forgiven? No, because now what you see is the next day you put the rat back in and now you reinstate the shocks, and the rat on the first shock reinstates as strong of a response as he had on first day. He did not forget what was going on day two. On day one, he learned this person here is bad news. On day two, learned not so much today. Day three, we're back to that again. Forgiving or recovering from trauma like that does not require forgetting. What it does seem to require is a different type of forgetting. Getting rid of the rumination that dominates your thoughts, dominates your emotions, angry focus on that. Okay, so some sense here of what forgiveness is and isn't. By the way, there's been a handful of people who've been pioneers in studying forgiveness science, and they've done cool stuff. One of them is named Everett Worthington, Virginia Commonwealth University, Mike McCullough, UC San Diego, Ken Pargham at Bowling Green University, and the late Carl Thorson, who's a wonderful man, colleague of mine at Stanford. So they've been trying to understand what are the parameters, what's going on when you forgive someone. And in a lot of ways, it depends on how you are framing your quest for forgiveness. Most broadly, is the key issue how you were feeling about the perpetrator, what they did to you? Or are you mostly focusing on how are you responding to what happened? But before those two major ones, another domain where one could focus is the cognitive aspects. Oh, I want to find out exactly what happened, exactly the details, because it turns out It really wasn't that person's fault. It wasn't intentional. That's a pathway for forgiveness. Another one that doesn't fall into the it's either the perpetrator or the victim is instead people who get to forgiveness through some sort of transcendent mechanism that transcends all. And we can immediately anticipate what one of those is when the survivors or the loved ones of the people killed in the AME church in Charleston, when they were forgiving the shooter a few days later, a couple of them expressed the same thought, which is God forgives you, Jesus forgives you. I should be able to as well. That is a motivator for doing it. Or an even more abstract version of transcendence that I've seen a few people emphasize in their thinking, the whole notion of being able to simultaneously live with two conflicting truths. And Kierkegaard apparently said that being a good Christian requires you to simultaneously live with two contradictory strong truths. In this case, producing the notion that the less forgivable the act, the more you have to find the means to forgive the person. Okay, so those are horses of a different color, cognitive, transcendent. Mostly it comes down to a pathway towards forgiving the perpetrator. And what that is often about is adventures in perspective taking and empathy and trying to understand how they became the sort of person who would do what they did. And what you see with that is you are tapping into parts of the brain that specialize in theory of mind, what's going on in someone else's head, what thoughts, what emotions, what histories, what traumas, what needs, what deficits, what adversities have they gone through that I haven't a clue about. That is a number of parts of the brain involved. One that's gotten a lot of attention is called the TPJ, the temporal parietal junction, which is very active in theory of mind. There's a whole process there of trying to understand the other person and understanding. God help me sounding like such a liberal, but when one looks at root causes of things that need to be forgiven, the notion that both you and the perpetrator are victims of some external circumstance. Bleeding heart, nonetheless. Okay, so that's focusing on the perpetrator. Much more common, though, is people find their way to forgiveness by focusing on its effect on themselves. And in a sense, a very insular, not a pejorative sense of the word here, but a very self serving, selfish motive. Great quote from Booker T. Washington. I will never let a man bespoil my soul by making me hate him, because hating him, I don't know, whatever with respect to him, but hatred, carrying around hatred, that is what rots away at my soul. And the notion of most approaches to forgiveness is one of recognizing how much damage it does to the person who is the victim, who is not able to forgive, who is not able to move past that aspect of it. And a great example of this was seen some years ago. Norway, Anders Breivik, mass shooter, white supremacist, killed 70 plus people. Unbelievable. And he's in the far, far more progressive, humane Norwegian prison system than virtually anywhere else on earth. And at one point, he wanted to apply to college and take college courses, and there was all sorts of public outcry saying, oh my God, now I should be able to take these mail order college courses after what he did. And eventually the warden there gave him permission to do that. And when asked what it was about, said, I'm not doing it for Breivik. I'm doing it for us to know we are treating this individual humanely, for us to know he can never do damage again, for us to know we don't have to think about him. So there's a physiology to this. What is very clear is being able to forgive is great for mental health. What about for physical health. And here's where it's far less clear. There is a small literature by now showing that when you get people to wallow in their grievances, their resentments, the things they have not forgiven people for, tell me about a time someone did something terrible to you that you haven't forgiven them for. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate, glucocorticoid release, sympathetic nervous system. What else? Muscle tension, electromyography is the technique used for that. Focusing on your hatreds is very stressful, is bad for your health. What is far less clear, though, from the literature is taking somebody dwelling on the hatreds and the unforgiveness, pretty clearly bad, taking someone from neutral to getting them to forgive, and the literature is a little bit mushy on that. Maybe some indications of lower stress hormone levels, maybe some indications of immune system working better. Mostly very small effects, kind of a squishy field. And one interesting finding that nonetheless is confounded with confounds, you take people not who have forgiven the act, an explicit act of a perpetrator, but people who have a personality, a forgiving personality. And what you find is, on the average, their health is better than everyone else's. But that tells you nothing about chickens and eggs and carts and horses and correlation and causality. Okay, so that's a sense of where forgiveness comes from. And it ain't easy. And I think what we see in most cases, the motivation for it is to stop having your own literal or metaphorical soul poisoned by hatred. It is an act of kindness to yourself.
So, we are going to wrap up with a sensitive topic here with the question. Recently, a young student at our local university took his own life. As family and friends grieve, many are tormented by guilt, wondering what they could have done differently, whether they could have made this person feel more loved, and if that might have made a difference. Science has helped dismantle the harmful notion that suicide is simply a matter of weakness or cowardice, giving us a clearer understanding of its complexities. But is there any science that absolves those of us left behind? Is there anything we can do to better protect our loved ones? Is there something we should do differently?
Well, a very painful topic. Uh, First off, getting our definitions. What types of suicide are we talking about here? What types, God help me for using a phrase like this, what types are the conventional bread and butter suicides that are relevant in the context of this question? Which ones are we ruling out suicide in a religious context? Widows throwing themselves on the funeral pyre of their deceased husband, suicide bombers, cults like Jonestown in 1979, suicide as an alternative to surrender, the first century Judeans fighting against the Romans on Masada, mass suicide rather than surrender, Japanese soldiers and civilians on the island of Saipan in 1944, mass suicide rather than surrender to the American troops that were advancing on them. None of these are ones we're talking about. We're talking about throughout the world, number 10 cause of death. In China, interestingly, number 5 cause. And what's clear is that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of numbers, about 900,000 people a year. That doesn't even begin to take into account the attempts at suicide. There's consistent sex differences, which is in westernized countries at least, women attempt suicide more often than men. Men complete suicide more often than women. And what that has much to do with is firearms that we'll be getting to. Okay, so what are the predictors of suicide? Seeing it coming. And here, going over a literature that has examined some of the reliable predictors. And the whole point of my going over this is it has nothing to do with the answer to the question, because this is talking about populations of people. On the average, people with a history of mental illness have a much higher likelihood of committing suicide than people who don't. About half of suicides involve someone with a mental illness, and it's typically of two flavors, one of a mood disorder, depression, one of a disorder of impulse, where on a moment's notice you leap, you pull the trigger. People with bipolar disorder during a manic phase, people with schizophrenia. So, mental illness. What else? What else comes into it? Uh, Despair, stress, rejection, instability, poverty. Poverty is a great predictor. And one interesting historical case of this, there was a massive increase in suicides in the early 1990s, just after the Soviet Union collapsed in ex-Soviet Union Russia, and a tremendous increase in what came to be called deaths of despair, a term that's now been used for the United States because of two remarkable things. One, Russia during that period, and now United States even before COVID, a decrease in life expectancy. And that's due to violence, that's due to substance abuse, that's due to increased rates of heart disease, and that's increased rates of suicide, overwhelmingly among men, when society becomes unstable, when one is rejected, when one is irrelevant, all of those things. What else? Substance abuse is always a good route towards suicide. That's a big predictor. Addiction, not being able to beat it during withdrawal, any such sort of scenario like that, that's a big factor in it. What else? Being ill, chronic disease, being elderly, disproportionate share of suicides come from elderly individuals. What do you see also? No surprises after grief, loss. There's this whole weird world of copycat suicides where a charismatic adolescent in a community or a charismatic celebrity commit suicide, and that's a trigger for some other people who are just very, very painfully caught up in that. Okay, so that's looking at what some of the reliable motivations are that predict an increased likelihood of suicide. The other half of the equation, along with motivation, is the means to do so. And that's where some other predictors come in. In the United States is unprecedented in that we have slightly more than 50% of our suicides due to firearms. No other country is remotely near that. And you see, this makes it possible for rapid, impulsive decisions about suicide, access to it there. Interestingly, in China, an awful lot of the suicides there are in rural areas, agriculturalists, people without a history of, say, a mood disorder, but after a conflict, some social shaming, things of that sort. And what they do is they drink pesticides, and pesticide availability is getting more and more limited in China and India and nearby countries as a means to driving down the rate of suicides there. So that's another issue of access. Okay, so we've just learned a lot about the risk factors, mental illness, societal stress, poverty, drug addiction, illness, access to means to commit suicide. So, what does that tell us about the question that was raised here? And the answer is absolutely nothing. Because what we've been hearing about is you take 10,000 people with bipolar disorder and 10,000 without, and you're seeing if there's significant difference in rates of suicide, and you're on pretty solid ground in predicting that there will be more suicides in the bipolar community and involving moments of manic impulsivity or whatever. Yeah, study whole populations. This tells us nothing on an individual level. And this is such an important point that I want to get very, very specific here. Going through this whole literature of being able to predict on the individual level if this is someone who is at high risk for suicide, justifying hospitalizing them, justifying putting them on a suicide watch, justifying various sorts of interventions. How does everything I just went over teach us about how to predict which individual is now more at risk for suicide? And the answer is a huge, careful literature shows that there's no predictors at all. And here's where I'm going to be very specific. 2019, a paper in JAMA Psychiatry, an American group. Final sentence referring to prediction questionnaires, prediction models for trying to decide which individual is going to commit suicide. Their accuracy of predicting a future event is near zero. Final sentence of the abstract. 2017, Australian group, British Journal of Psychiatry. Conclusion, quote, no high risk classification was clinically useful. 2016, British Journal of Psychiatry, Hong Kong and Canada, two populations, quote, no scales have sufficient evidence to support their use. British Journal of Psychiatry Open, Australia 2021. This was a fancy modern one of using machine learning to see if we could predict on the individual level who is going to be at elevated risk for suicide. And their conclusion was machine learning, its superiority over other methods remains unproven. PLOS One, that's another journal, 2017 from Norway. Low predictive value of any of the prediction instruments used. Psychology Bulletin, 2017, a group at Harvard that looked at 50 years worth of studies of prediction of suicide on the individual level. And their conclusion was across those 50 years, no predictability at all. No significant predictability. The lack of predictive power has been consistent over those 50 years. It is impervious to how long of a study it is, the prospective study. And just to sort of put the frosting on top here, this is another British Journal of Psychiatry paper, 2016 from New Zealand, where the title of the paper says it all, title being The Futility of Risk Prediction in Psychiatry. So we look at a young person who kills themselves, we look at a loved one, we look at something unbearable like that. And the absolute logical, immediate emotional response is, how could I have missed the signs? Is there something I could have done? Could I have loved them more? Could I have told them more that I loved them? Are there things I should have done? Could it have been prevented if only I could have foreseen the signs? And what this literature covering 50 years of research, prestigious journals, a whole bunch of different measurements, etc., what it tells you is you couldn't have predicted it. Yes, the futility of it, you couldn't have prevented it by having seen the signs, because statistically meaningful signs were not going to have been there. You couldn't have prevented it by loving them more, because that was not a predictor of what caused it. That, I think, is the punchline. So I think what the science is telling us here is there is no science as to how to predict on the level of individuals at risk. And thus, there is no science to support the notion that you should have been able to prevent it.
And that is it for episode 66. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.